Okay, great. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our fireside chat or virtual fireside chat on building in our today's module on building resilience. And we're very excited to have the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, the Honorable Adam Smith, who represents the great state of Washington, and with us. And I just want to, welcome you, there's Chairman Smith.
Well, good to be here. Thank you. Appreciate the chance and appreciate your work.
Great. Well, wonderful. So I'm just going to dive right in. I guess the first question is, you were the principal author for at least the House version of the National Defense Authorization Act, which, governs a lot of the sets of rules, policies and legislation for authorization for many things that drive the overall government contracting community, the government and industry, as well as, academics, and so that analyze it. The current NDAA for FY21 is in conference, so it's not going to be dealt with after the election. I was wondering if you could, seems like a theme of yours was this topic of resilience. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the NDAA that the House passed and where you see things going as far as getting through conference.
Sure. I'll talk a little bit about the bill and where we're at, and then get into the sort of the contracting industrial-based resilience issue, which I think is crucially important. Yeah, we passed the bill in the House. They passed it in the Senate. There are a little over 2,000 individual items combined between the House and the Senate. So starting in mid-August, the staffs on both sides have been sort of pouring through that, trying to figure out what we can resolve to get to the point where we can get a conference report. We weren't going to be able to get that done by October 1st. And now that both the House and the Senate are out for a while, we are not going to formally go to conference until after the election. And the plan is to have a bill on the floor the first week of December. As always, there's issues, differences of opinion between the House, the Senate, and the White House. But there are a lot fewer issues this year than there were last year. So I'm pretty optimistic we'll be able to sort through it, but there's a lot of work to be done. People see the end product, but the work that goes in on the staff and member level going through, the literally thousands of provisions that are offered, accepted, rejected, modified. It's a lot of work. But look, one key component of this year's bill and going forward is going to be industrial base issues. And there's a bunch of different ways to think about it. I think that the most important way to think about it is crucial to national security that we have the technological advantage, that U.S. companies and the U.S. defense industry and Department of Defense get access to the best new technologies as they come forward. And I would say that at this point, the U.S. is less dominant in that area than we used to be. I'm not going to say that we're behind or we're getting our lunch eaten or we're in terrible shape, but we're not as dominant as we used to be. And certainly the main peer competitor on that is China. They are developing new technologies and moving forward. So we have got to work more to build the relationship between the contractor community and DoD to increase the speed, increase the competition, and increase the output of the technology ideas that we get to help us move forward. Now, there's a whole bunch of different reasons for this. And you think, well, we hear about AI and hypersonics and cyber, and what does all this mean? The simplest way to think about this is that in modern warfare, the key is to see your enemy before they see you, know where they are, and try to make it more difficult for them to know where you are. Because all the platforms in the world, all the missiles and all the aircraft carriers and all the high-tech airplanes and tanks, if the enemy finds you before you find them, if your ability to operate is taken down, then you lose. And this means we have to make massive investments in command and control, massive investments in technology and cyber, so that hopefully we can disrupt our enemy's systems and prevent our systems from being disrupted. And we're not going to get there without a very strong, resilient relationship with the private sector, with the innovators and the entrepreneurs and the companies who are developing those new technologies. And the final thing I'll say on this, big question you asked there, I could have taken up the whole hour answering it, I won't, is one big key piece of this is artificial intelligence. Because the modern era, information is almost ubiquitous. It's everywhere. You've got all this. How do you sort through it? How do you process it? How do you know what threats coming at you are most important? Artificial intelligence can help you process that amount of data in a way never before seen. The analogy that always sort of brought it home to me was chess. I don't play chess very much, but they developed a computer that could play chess. Well, early on, the way they did that is they pumped into the computer every known chess strategy. And so the computer then could choose from what humans knew. The computer did pretty well, but didn't win all the time. But what now they developed is they simply told the computer the rules of the game and said, figure it out. And the computer has never been beaten in that scenario. And most interestingly, as you watch the computer play, it will make decisions that chess masters will go, well, you can't do that. That's not the way it's played. By can't do that, they mean that's a stupid move. You're going to get. The computer is figuring out new ways to play the game that make it even stronger. And if you apply that to warfare, you figure out new ways that don't readily occur to people to give you a great advantage. So that's the overview of why we're doing all the stuff with the industrial base that we're doing, so that we can have the strongest military in this modern, technologically complicated era of warfare.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. I mean, there's a little bit of your discussion that AI kind of brings up Skynet a little bit. It's just like, how do we, the concerns about, computers moving so fast, but we've just got to adapt that to our systems, I guess, the way that we can, yeah. Great. One of the things there, even prior to COVID, well, during COVID and even prior to COVID, there was a discussion that defense budgets, were going to be sort of flat going forward. And then that sort of has accelerated in discussions given the spending on COVID response, which is of course very needed to face the pandemic. Where do you see, the budget trends going forward?
Well, the first part of that is to sort of understand, where is the Budget Act? We are in unprecedented times in the sense that we have been running a significant deficit for a long time. I always remember I got elected to Congress in 1996.
Yeah.
And at the time, growing up in the 80s, the deficit, I don't know, it worried me. In some ways, it worried me more than the prospect of nuclear war. I figured we wouldn't actually do that to ourselves. We would, in fact, actually incinerate the planet in a nuclear war. But I could absolutely picture us spending ourselves into oblivion. I was like really worried, how are we going to function as a country, being that much in debt for that long? And then, of course, we balanced the budget, made some decisions, got lucky with the economy, and had a surplus for 4 years in the late 90s. Well, as you know, we've gone the other way, which raises the question, how much debt is too much? I mean, we're pushing up $23, $24 trillion right now with no particular end in sight. So when you get to the question of what's the defense budget going to look like, the first question you have to ask is, what is fiscal policy going to look like for the next 20 years? Now, we're lucky right now because we can borrow money for next to nothing. Inflation is very low. Interest rates are very low. And the second thing is the U.S. has an incredible advantage because we are the reserve currency for the world. And I don't understand how to explain all the economics for why that gives us an advantage, but it does. But the question is, okay, we're the reserve currency for the world right now. Once upon a time, Great Britain was the reserve currency for the world. But then around about the 1920s and 1930s, that blew up because they overextended themselves and a whole bunch of other complicated reasons. So question number one is, what do we want our fiscal policy to look like? How much debt can we absorb over the course of the next 20 years? How high can the deficit be from one year to the next? Once you sort of cut through that, and then, okay, well, what percentage of the budget can go to defense? And right now, that percentage is roughly 16 or 17%. That there are some people who quibble with me and say that the VA budget ought to count against defense, however you want to calculate it. But if you're talking purely the DoD budget, it's roughly 17% of the overall budget, which is a fairly low number historically. It's also a low number as a percentage of GDP. However, we do have greater needs now than we did have, say, in the 50s and 60s. 50s and 60s was before Medicare, before Medicaid. So where does the budget plug into that? I think the reasonable assumption is, yeah, the defense budget is going to be flat for a while. And there is no reason on earth, in my view, that we cannot defend the United States of America for $740 billion. So I think the better question, the question to focus on, is how do we spend that money? How do we get more out of it? We have not had a terribly productive last 20 years. Anyone passingly familiar with the defense budget, as I'm sure most of the people on this call are, can go through, the cost of the F-35, the cost of the Ford class carrier. And that's not even counting programs like the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, the Comanche helicopter, and a whole bunch of others that just went poof. We spent a lot of money, didn't get anything. We have got to work with the contractor community to get better about how we spend our money and the results we get for that money.
Yeah. Yeah. And there seems to be within the Democratic caucus sort of a division too, in terms of some in your caucus would like to cut funding, defense funding more under a Biden administration. And, how do you all navigate that within your caucus? Is that a fair assessment of the situation?
Oh yeah, it's a very fair assessment. I gave an interview last week in which I got into this, and I'm sure a lot of people are like, oh, don't talk about our differences. And, it is what it is. And we're going to have to deal with it. If, knock on wood, from my perspective, we do, in fact, if the election goes the way the polls currently, make it look like it's going to go, and Joe Biden gets elected president, we have a Democratic Senate, we're going to be in charge. And yeah, well, I can get myself in trouble. It's a problem with being on video. I don't know I can't look out at the audience and read anybody's face. So I just sort of go, blah. But I'll just tell you the truth. I mean, in my opinion, as we look at the challenges our country faces, certainly COVID, the economy, increasingly competitive world, equity and social justice issues that have led to a level of disruption in society that we haven't seen since the 60s. We got big problems that need to be confronted. So how do we get there? Personally, I believe in pragmatic solutions. I always say that politics is about bringing diverse groups of people together, working together, and trying to solve problems. It's not about partisan ideology. I don't believe anyone out there has the 5-point plan to solve all the world's problems. We learn as we go and bring people together. So how do we get there? Well, step number one, to my mind, and this is the first thing I'm going to say that runs the risk of offending people, I think Donald Trump is an epic disaster as president. As someone who has worked in politics and public policy my whole life, and in a bipartisan way, okay, this is not a partisan comment. The personality, the corruption, the narcissism, it is the polar opposite to me of what any public figure, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, whatever your ideology, this is not the way to run anything, much less the most powerful, prosperous country in the history of the world. So for me, to deal with these problems, step one is to remove that problem. But that is not the only problem. Okay, so let's say Democrats win. We then have to govern. Democrats have not successfully governed this country since the mid-'60s. Okay, a couple of times we got in charge, and 2 years later, the public went and threw us all out of power in increasingly large numbers. So how do we pull together a coalition that can actually govern effectively? Okay, we can win an election because people are appalled by Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean that they're endorsing us in any sort of big, huge, dramatic way. And to do that, we've got to work with a broad coalition of people. As I've pointed out, that the people who want to get Donald Trump out of office range from Bernie Sanders to the Lincoln Project. All right. That's a pretty wide, ideological spread. And part of this is part of the ideological spread on the Democratic side wants to see the defense budget dramatically cut. And by dramatically, I mean like 20%, maybe more than that. I don't think that's the right approach. I don't think that's a solid national security strategy. And there are reasons that I think I understand why some in the progressive movement want to see that done. So I'm working with them to try to, get to a better place, and also, going to build a coalition to put forward what I think is a rational, democratic, progressive national security strategy. I don't think that rational policy involves a 20% defense cut, but that fight is going to be had, because as much as I, sort of talk about ideological extremism on the right, it's not the exclusive purview of the right. That there's extremists on the right and extremists on the left. And what I'm trying to do is say, look, let's go for pragmatic problem solving. I don't see extremism solving problems.
Okay, great. Yeah, one of the things when you're talking about bipartisan approaches, the initial response to COVID, both on the federal side as well as in Congress, was quite bipartisan. The CARES Act passed in very late March, the largest piece of legislation ever, appropriation. And one of the things that is sort of not really well known, I think, outside of sort of defense circles, is some of the tremendous release and acquisition changes that were put in that bill. The relief of caps of undefended contract actions, or UCAs, the permanent authority for other transactions authority, raising the caps on that, raising the thresholds on the Defense Production Act, as well as the reimbursement through 3610 of contract resources for COVID expenses. So, and some of those have had tremendous impact on the operations of companies. Do you see a lot of those kind of those measures sticking, or do you see them kind of coming back a little bit because it's really helping to get more out of the defense dollar, to your point about being more efficient how we do things? So I want to get your thoughts on the CARES Act and some of those provisions.
Yeah, I think, overall, on the issues that I've been talking about how do we start getting more for the money we spend, how do we focus on the right products, right technologies. I think, starting with Ash Carter and Bob Work and Frank Kendall, and moving forward into the three secretaries of defense that we've had under President Trump, there has been a concerted effort to address these issues. And I think, the bottom-up review, the night court, okay, where are we spending our money? How are we spending our money? How can we do it better? And then also, the industrial base issues. What do we need to preserve within our industrial base? And COVID sort of accelerated that, as a lot of key contractors and key producers were under enormous stress and continue to be. How can we make sure we keep them from going under? I think a lot of those provisions that have worked in a reasonably positive way to move us forward. And I think that's what we're going to have to do going forward. But, two parts of it. One is, how do you deal with the short-term crisis of COVID? And then two, how do you build, a more durable, sustainable, and effective contractor base? Now, part of the conflict we have is we try to figure out, do we pump more money into this? Do we drive more dollars out to some of our contractor base? There's been pushback and complaints, and you saw just a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I can't remember, but the story came out that defense had misappropriated funds, taken money that was intended for COVID relief and spent it on defense contractors. That story isn't actually accurate. You will note that 3 committees in Congress are doing an investigation of this, and I'm not one of them, because there's nothing to investigate here in my view. This was part of the CARES Act. We gave $1 billion to DOD to deal with COVID-related expenses. And very specifically in that, it said one of the COVID-related expenses you could deal with was the defense industrial base, which they did. And now we're chewing on them for doing that. Now, you can quibble about the fact that they spent roughly 2/3 of the money on that. Should they have spent more on testing equipment and PPE and, building, I don't know, 6 feet distance into training? Did they balance the money out the correct way? Now, we can argue about that, but there was nothing illegal about what they did. They didn't take money. It wasn't like when they took money out of Milcon and spent it on the wall, for instance. Right. It was perfectly within exactly what Congress told them to do. And there is nothing to investigate, in my view. But that's going to drive pressure, in the COVID relief, world. Is it really that important to make sure that we can buy more fighter planes or, I don't know, buy more military equipment? I think it is important to make sure we keep the industrial base going, but there's going to be pressure on that. And the final piece of pressure on that is if you drive that money out to the contractor community, do you drive it out to the right folks? Because there's concern that, the large defense contractors, they have liquidity, they have protection. They don't need extra money to stay in business. So if we drive the money out, do they hold on to the money, or does that money really get down to that? And I always think of like the 100-person shop down in the Kent Valley in my district that's making machine parts for aircraft carriers, that is losing all of their commercial contracts right now. Are they going to be able to stay? And is the money getting to those small contractors? I think those questions are worth asking as we look at whether or not to do more along the lines of what you described.
Yeah, no, that's great. Let me tell the audience, so if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A box, and we'll intersperse those with our dialogue here. But I want to kind of follow up on two threads you point out. One is the Defense Production Act, but I want to hit that second. The other issue is the next stimulus bill for COVID. I mean, there was initial drafts that had several $1 billion for defense needs. I think the Senate had $8 billion for DPA money, and then I think your most recent bill in the House had much less. So I was wondering if you could talk about, in light of some of that, some of the recent stories, where do you see the COVID kind of stimulus bill, the status of that, and will there be sort of a defense or security funding in that?
It's in a tough place. The overall bill's in a tough place because, Democrats want to do a lot more than Republicans want to do. Yeah. Put simply, we passed over we started out basically, we were at 3.5 trillion. They were at zero. Yeah. That's where we were at in mid-May. And frankly, that's where we were at until the end of July. Then the Republicans came up to 400 billion. We came down to a little over 2 trillion, but still the gap is enormous. And I think the Democratic position is, we need to do a lot, that the economy has not bounced back. You've got long-term unemployment. You've got state and local governments that are facing massive deficits. You've got people who can't pay their rent, can't pay bills. You've got public health needs. And, the Speaker Pelosi and Secretary Mnuchin have been negotiating. They just haven't been able to get there. So at this point, it's increasingly unlikely that we will get a COVID relief package before the election. If we get one, I think the idea that there's going to be a lot more money in there for defense is unlikely. As you know, DoD is asking for around 20 billion more in a variety of different programs to spend on, to spend on equipment. And do they need that 20 billion more on top of a $740 billion budget? That's debatable. Right. I think they probably need a little bit more to help with some of those small contractors that I mentioned. But right now we can't get the overall bill done. So it's going to be tough.
Yeah, and I think about 10 of that was going to be for the 3610, the company reimbursement, I think. And that's, okay. So on the Defense Production Act, when I was in the Pentagon during the Obama and Trump administration, I ran this thing called the Defense Production Act, which at the time very few people knew anything about. And the Title III office, which does a lot of the funding, which you put $1 billion into, had about a $20 million a year budget. So it's personally, it's great to see the Defense Production Act being used in that kind of way, because it's really about building industrial capacity. And they started doing this before even COVID. There was a bipartisan kind of consensus on the need to address like rare earths and microelectronics. And so there are a number of projects that were going, and then COVID seemed to put that on tremendous speed. And you talk about the $1 billion really was the largest appropriation ever for the Defense Production Act. But then where do you see that that going forward? Did the spending, as you outlined, a lot of it did go into traditional defense industrial base issues. And there's, sort of the argument, there's different sides of the argument, and you articulated one. But where do you think kind of overall congressional attitudes are going to be going forward for the DPA?
Well, that's one of the big things that I want to try to drive home, to my caucus in particular, is to understand the strengths of the Department of Defense. I think if you I should have explained a little bit more why the Progressive Caucus wants to make such dramatic cuts. I mean, they believe that we have over-militarized our foreign policy. And, one of the biggest driving reasons behind that is the Iraq War. And the Iraq War, I think, was a policy mistake without getting into that debate. But that has driven a very strong feeling that the more money we spend on DoD, the more likely we are to wind up in wars that are not in our best interests. Well, the DoD is a lot more than that. I think the strengths of what the Department of Defense does need to be recognized. And that's where we can spend, money on things like the Defense Production Act. I mean, when the whole COVID thing broke, this was going to be a massive challenge. And part of that challenge was a logistical challenge. How do you produce all of the equipment in the quantities that you need quickly? Well, we have enormous capacity in this country. It's just in other directions. How do you repurpose it? Well, nobody is better at that type of large-scale logistical problem than the Department of Defense. They make a lot of stuff and they move a lot of stuff, more than anybody else in the world, and they're very good at it. So let's take advantage of that skill set, to help with those logistical problems, and let's take advantage of the industrial base that exists. Much of the industrial base exists, in the defense space, and say, okay, let's make what we need to make by taking advantage of that skill set and moving it forward. And I don't think we did enough of that. Now it sounds like eventually we finally got to that place. DoD is very involved in the Operation Warp Speed effort to develop the vaccine. They've been involved in the increase in production of testing equipment like swabs. So I think the marriage between DoD needs and the broader needs of the US from a production and logistics standpoint is a lot closer than people realize. And we got to take advantage of that capacity to meet the needs of society and to work with DoD on that. So I hope we can do more in the future, not just on public health crisis, but when we look at, meeting our industrial base needs more broadly. I think DoD can be a real asset on that for all of us.
All right. Yeah, and the DPA is a presidential authority, which, so DoD just happens to execute it. So seeing that, HHS doing it and, using that authority as well, DoD can execute programs for DHS and other kinds of places where we need industrial capacity. So that's a great point. One of the emphasis that that leadership, DoD leaders like Ellen Lord, Secretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and others have talked about recently, the kind of emphasis on reshoring capabilities, and that's what you're alluding to, building domestic capacity. There's, some of the key areas there are focused on microelectronics and rare earths. And there seems to be, that's one area where it seems to be a lot of bipartisan support on that. So, but the question I have is that some of that then turns into sort of Buy America questions. That, in my view, is a little more problematic, because I think the defense sector is already kind of very heavily, there's Buy America laws that prevent most of the production a lot of it is in the US. Some areas where commercial, where we've had the China kind of encroachment, like rare earths and so on, microelectronics, are areas we need to really kind of reshore. But how do you balance that reshoring versus, there's a provision in the NDA that passed that, really ratchets up to Buy America. And that seems to me not addressing the real challenge, the real problem. Because the real problem is, how do we get out of the China business in areas of national security? That's public health, that is, homeland security issues, and then defense. So how do you balance that in a way, and what's your kind of view on that provision that passed in the House bill?
Yeah, I think what you've got, again, is you've got sort of two competing interests that do overlap, but aren't necessarily the same thing. The interest within the DoD world and the national security world that we're most interested in is our capabilities. How do we make sure that we have the capabilities that we need and we are not dependent upon China? I mean, you would say we don't want to be dependent upon countries that we can't depend on.
Yep.
But we're not dependent on a lot of manufacturing capacity out of Iran or North Korea, or even Russia for that matter.
Yep.
China's what we're worried about.
Yep.
Is, they have ramped up their level of competition with the West massively in the last 10 years. It is clear that they have taken a zero-sum approach to this, and that is that what's bad for us is good for them, and we cannot depend on them, in any real sense of the word. Now, I mean, we're the two largest economies in the world. There's going to be crossover. We're going to work together, but we don't want to be dependent upon them for things that are at the core of our national security needs. So we need to look at what we're dependent on and then say, okay, if not China, where do we go? And in this regard, I think it is a mistake to look at that and say, well, we have to onshore. We have to do everything in the U.S. It's a global economy. I mean, very few products that are sophisticated at all are made in one country. It's a partnership. What we need to do is we need to build alliances. Yes, build up our own industrial capacity to the extent possible here in the U.S. I'm 100% for that. But we also need to build partnerships. I think 5G is a good example. 5G and telecommunications technology in general. China's really been aggressive in that area with Huawei and ZTE and others. And they have built a lot of products that are out there on the market, and that's a threat to our national security. So is the solution, okay, we've got to make everything in the U.S. Well, a lot of the products we're looking for aren't made in the U.S. at all. But you've got Nokia, you've got Ericsson, you've got Samsung, and I'd much rather be, in partnership on these products with Europe or Taiwan than China. So I think when we look at the industrial base from a national security standpoint, part of it has to be what partners can we trust? How do we build stronger alliances so we can take advantage of the production skill set of other countries to meet our needs? Now, the second piece of this is a more domestic economic concern. And that is, the Rust Belt. That is, as manufacturing moved across the world, we lost a ton of jobs in different places in this country and had a huge impact on the blue collar workforce. And, has contributed greatly to the economic wealth disparity that we have in this country, that I think is probably the most disruptive factor that we face. The days when a blue collar job could give you enough money to have a decent home, send your kids to college and pay your bills, they're not there anymore. I live in this area. The southern part of my district is the sort of blue collar area that I grew up in. The northern part of my district is the Bellevue, Redmond, Seattle corridor in tech world, where people are rolling in money, which is great, but it's driven housing costs up to the point where your average blue collar worker can barely afford to live. How do we return good jobs? And I don't agree, and I've been hearing this for years, well, we'll just STEM, right? We'll teach everybody to be an engineer. Everyone will go off and get a 4-year degree, and then everyone will be fine. Now, two reasons that's a problem. Number one, not everybody can be an engineer, all right? That's not going to happen. Number two, there are jobs in this country that have to be done. All right. Blue collar jobs, driving trucks and working in warehouses and janitors. My father was a ramp serviceman at United Airlines. Those jobs we need to pay people a decent wage for those jobs. All right. So a lot of the Buy America is driven by wanting to bring back more jobs just for the pure economics of it. Yeah. And I think we need to balance those two interests. I'm working very closely with Congressman Norcross, who is the prime sponsor of the Buy America provision. He understands that we need to make modifications in this, but those are the two interests that we're trying to balance, or trying to achieve, actually, in our Buy America industrial base approach.
Okay. Good response. Yeah, one of the things you mentioned is the need for strong partners and allies, and there's a couple of kind of efforts that are really focused on that, like the National Technology Industrial Base, which was creating legislation, I think, in the 2016 NDAA, which essentially said that the U.S., Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom are one industrial base, and there are other provisions similar to that. It'd be what I'd like to do, and I'd like to get your reaction on, is that I think needs to be inculcated more to DoD practices, so that So you're actually creating opportunities for subsidiaries of those countries, or those companies based in those countries. So those are our true partners, plus, Japan and some of the ones you mentioned. So we need to create, so that really expands our industrial base in a way which builds that resiliency. That's my hypothesis. But
yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. That's the way we need to look at it.
yeah,
And I think defense is part of, but then the overall needs of our society. Okay,
yeah,
when you look at, how do you get the products and services that you need to function as a country as you would like? A huge part of that is your national security interest, no question.
yeah,
But there's also a big part of it that's public health, that's economics. I mean, this is what we ran into on COVID.
yeah,
All the PPEs not made in the U.S. Where do we go get it?
right,
We're looking at the effort on generic drugs. Lack of access to medications because so many of those were made in China. We're now trying
yeah,
to start that up.
yeah,
I think there is an intelligent way to strike that balance, and I think you described it quite well. And that's what we're going to try to do. I think it would be a mistake to look at this and say we got to bring everything back to the U.S.
yeah,
because, frankly, I'll walk through the example here, on generic drugs. We've all heard about the Kodak play that is being made where the U.S. government, loaned $750 million to Kodak to repurpose it to make generic drugs. Now, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. How do you go from making an instant camera to making a drug? But whatever, whatever's going on up there, people know more than I do. Let's say that they go forward with it. The real question for me is, okay, $750 million loan to get them off the ground. Can they compete? All right.
right,
Can they make a product at a cost that's going to enable them to survive? Or would it have made more sense to look for partners in other parts of the world who are better positioned to compete, and to help them get to where they need to be so that we're not dependent on China? We're dependent on, I don't know, Switzerland, a place that's easier to do. That's where you need to get into a more sophisticated economic conversation, because you don't want to make some big, huge investment that just goes under, that can't compete.
yeah. No, that's right. We have a question from Mr. Karhoff. How do you see, Chairman Smith, the receptivity of the Future of Defense Task Force report of the 23rd of September that was submitted to you and Ranking Member Thornberry? It calls for a discussion with the American people on how would this conversation take place.
Oh, I'm very excited about that task force. I mean, I worked with Congressman Moulton to get it set up in the first place. He and Congressman Banks, I think, did incredibly important work, and they looked at the questions that we led off with. What capabilities do we need to build to meet our national security interests, and how do we transition from legacy programs to those new capabilities?
Mm-hmm.
And I just read a book called The Kill Chain that was written by Chris Brose. Chris used to be McCain's staff director, so I worked with him in that capacity, that really focuses on this question. And that gets back to what I said up front, is having all the sophisticated platforms in the world doesn't work if they're interconnected by a single point of failure that the enemy can easily take down. How do we do that? I think that report, very thoughtful, very forward leaning, and something we're going to pay attention to. Now, the question of how do we get the American people on board with this, slowly and painfully is my basic answer. Look, that's what politics is. You got to be patient, and you got to be persistent, and you got to be inclusive. And that's something that has been, I think, the cornerstone of my political career, but also of my chairmanship, is to be inclusive, to bring people in, whether it's on the committee, staff, House, Senate, outside. You really want to get, in a representative democracy, you got to get the people invested in it. It's not a situation where one person can say, this is the right answer, and if you don't like it, tough. We need the political support for what we're trying to do. So what I plan to do is, in my leadership position, but also with the talent of the committee, and I really can't emphasize this point enough, this is the most talented Armed Services Committee I've ever served on, and that's bipartisan. I'm awful, proud and pleased of the 14 freshmen that we have on the Armed Services Committee on the Democratic side. Incredibly smart, talented people, but there's a lot of smart, talented people on the Republican side as well. And in a bipartisan way, we go out there and we make the case to the American people. This is where defense needs to go. And I think part of that is to convince people that the United States retreating from the world is not in our best interests. It's, it's alluring. It's, gosh, well, let's just not worry about it. Let's stop caring about what goes on in the Middle East or what's happening in Eastern Europe or, what China and Taiwan are doing. That's, it's just not worth it. Let's just come home and forget about it. That's not in our best interests. That doesn't mean that it's a military solution to all of this, but it does mean that we need to engage in an intelligent way in what's going on the globe. Our defense capabilities are one tool in that toolbox, not the only one, not even the most important one. We've got diplomacy, we've got development, we've got alliances, a whole bunch of different ways to do it. But we need to make the case to the American people, to a skeptical American people. Because whether it's Iraq or the fact that we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years, or the fact that the war against transnational terrorists persists. So we've got Libya, we've got Syria, we've got Somalia, we've got West Africa. We've got all this stuff going on. The American public are like, we're tired of it all. We've got to make the case to them. Here's why the defense budget is what it is. Here's why we're trying to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, and here's why it's in your best interest. And we're going to be very aggressive about having public hearings and public discussions to listen to people, to listen to those concerns and try to address them. And I think what Seth was able to do on that task force is an excellent first step.
Great. Today we've had two panels before our discussion. One was on strengthening supply chains, and that's a lot of what we've discussed. We've discussed to this point. The other panel was on the CMMC, or Cybersecurity Maturation Model Certification, which is kind of a mouthful. The implementation of that. That's been a sort of a DoD effort that's built on the NIST standards for cybersecurity. What's the congressional view of CMMC and your personal perspective on that, how that effort's been developing?
I think the easiest way to sum it up is it's a work in progress that is enormously important. I could babble on for quite some time about the details of that. But I think we've got a ways to go to really figure out cyber policy. I think this is a good approach. A lot more work needs to be done to get it to where it needs to be, but it's crucial. I mean, when I'm talking about, how do we see the enemy before they see us? How do we protect our systems while, trying to attack the systems of our opposition? Obviously, cyber is at the cornerstone of that. And it's interesting. I mean, China, obviously, you think of, their investments in technology and how they're getting stronger in that. But even Russia, as we know, has sort of gone into the cyber domain and seen it as a relatively low cost way to disrupt. And we've got a lot of catching up to do in terms of organizing this. And this gets into another key part. So how do we catch up? How do we make sure that cyber gets to where it needs to be? Again, I'll emphasize, working with the innovators, with the companies in our country that are developing the new technologies. I think the relationship between the most innovative companies in this country and DoD is not as strong as it needs to be. There is stuff we need to do to build those relationships so that the DoD problems are being worked on by the best and the brightest out there. And we're taking advantage of things that are being developed in the private sector. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to solidify that. But part of that would be, getting a coherent cyber policy. And that's what this effort is aimed at.
I see. Okay, great. As a sidebar to that, on the innovation side, there's been a number of efforts done by DoDs in the prior administration and then current in terms of Defense Innovation Unit and some other Army Futures Command, but those are really small kind of efforts. I know Congress has been very engaged in trying to, create pathways for this, but it seems like we do have a ways to go in that regard.
Yes. No, cyber's difficult. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, when I became chairman of the terrorism subcommittee, had jurisdiction over SOCOM and also directly jurisdiction over cyber and technology. I traveled all around the country and, visited military bases. And I used to joke that every military base I went to said the same thing. we're the key cyber command. We are the area that is in charge of all cyber for the Army. And I was like, we're in charge of all cyber for DoD. I'm like, how can there be 10 of you that are in charge of all of it? I mean, it was kind of, everyone was doing a little bit. The coordination was difficult. Now, since then, we've stood up the cyber command. The efforts have been made to try to better consolidate that approach. One other point that I should make here is the biggest key, to my mind, to cyber is having the human resources, the talent. Because cyber is always going to be a day in and day out battle. You're never going to develop the perfect system that's impenetrable and then be able to go to bed for 6 months and not worry about it. It is a moment to moment challenge. And what you need, really smart people who understand this. And that's something that I've worked on with Eric Schmidt, the defense, I forget the name of the Defense Policy Board.
Defense Innovation Board.
Innovation Board, there we go. He and Bob worked on that for quite a while. And that's one of the key things that they point out is how do we bring into government the type of, technology savvy, those smart innovators that are working in Silicon Valley. Right now, it's very difficult. I mean, my gosh, it takes 2 years to get your clearance. And a lot of people they don't have anything to do with that. We've got to figure out a way to more easily bring into, civilian, DoD as well as active duty, that talent. Because that talent's what's going to put us in the best position to deal with those issues.
Great. I've got a question coming in to follow on the Kodak example you're talking about. So the Kodak, I mean, I think there's a good case being made about maybe that's not the right kind of investment, essentially establish a new line of business for Kodak, the competitiveness of that. But the underlying authority that was done, this was the reestablishment of a loan authority for the Defense Production Act, which had been quiescent for 50 years. And so doing that under the successor to OPIC, I forget the acronym now, the office that does that. So do you think that that seems like a good way to help companies? It uses the same criteria title of DPA, which is that it's got to be something essential for defense, and and the key, as you alluded to, is also it's got to be help that company then be commercially successful. So, but having that loan authority seems like an avenue that might be promising as we try to build resilience in the domestic base. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I read the question that Kayleen asked. I think it's very appropriate, and I'm thinking of a Jones Act example, which is not necessarily directly related, but it has some relation to maintaining U.S. shipbuilding ability. Yeah. And what the companies are always complaining about, okay, you tell us you got the Jones Act. You tell us that if we build these ships, we're going to have exclusive access to these contracts. And that's the economic incentive because it's more expensive to build ships in the U.S. than it would be to build them elsewhere. But then we constantly have exceptions to the Jones Act, and an emergency comes up and we waive the Jones Act. So if you're making, and I don't know, it's a multi-billion-dollar decision. I don't know exactly how many $billion involved in building some of these ships, but if you're making that decision and you can't count on getting the work, you can't count on those protections, or as Kayleen references, you're competing with other countries that are not shy about having the government prop up their shipbuilding industry or whatever other manufacturer would be out there. Okay, if I say that people up in Kodak won't be able to compete, well, if we took steps to help them, then they would be better able to compete, and individual investors in the US and individual businesses would be more likely to make the decision to build something domestically if they knew there was going to be economic support and business on the back end. And I think that's a very valuable point. Now, there's a level of economic sophistication that I do not possess in this moment to figure out, okay, well, how much money for what industries, for what part of it? That requires, in-depth analysis and people a lot smarter than me to do it. But from a policy perspective, what we need to do is to provide, whether it's a loan program, whether it's guaranteed business, as with the Jones Act, something that says, if you build it here, we're going to help the economics work for you. We're going to create a situation where the return on your investment will be sufficient, because these are business decisions. I mean, no one's going to say, well, I'm just going to build this out of the goodness of my heart because I'd like the U.S. to have it. The numbers have got to play out to get the investors to make that investment and build it. But there's things that we as policymakers can do to nudge that to nudge that equation in a positive direction, to make the numbers play out so that it makes economic sense to manufacture domestically.
Great. I think unless anyone has any additional questions, I wanted to, we've had the audience that we have, Chairman, is we have a number of government officials, a lot of contracting officers and folks that actually, put things on contract and work in programs. Then we have industry participants as well as some academic perspectives. Where do you think, what are your thoughts going forward on how industry can help the executive and congressional branches build this resiliency, and how can places like George Mason University also contribute to that those efforts?
As I was looking at those questions that were still on my board there and thinking about it, one thing the U.S. really has never had for a while is an actual industrial policy. And I think, what George Mason and all the is, number one, make the decision to have one. And number two, give us the expertise to help develop one. And that's where, as I was mentioning a moment ago, stuff that I don't understand that well, people who are making investments, people at your university, the people on this call who are contractors, they're making those decisions on a day in and day out basis. And they can really inform us about how to develop that industrial policy. And it's good to also sort of think about why it is that we don't have the industrial policy that we need. Part of the reason we don't have the industrial policy is for years we didn't need one because we dominated. We dominated the world. And people, I remember seeing this stat, must have been 20, 25 years ago now. And I forget where I came across it, but in 1948, the United States was responsible for 90% of global manufacturing. 90%.
Right.
And you'd think, okay, wow, 1948, man, we were doing things right. Well, no, it was a historical accident. The entire industrialized world had just been blown off the face of the map, or as I like to put it, if you're going to fight a war, there are two things that are kind of helpful. Number one, it helps to win. But number two, it helps even more if you fight it on the road, which is what we were able to do. And that put us in a position where we had an industrial policy. We win. Okay. That was our industrial policy. There's no point in thinking about it. Well, the rest of the world got up off the ground, as was inevitable, and as frankly was in the best interests of our country as well. That's why we invested in the Marshall Plan and a whole bunch of other things. And now we have to compete, which we haven't thought about competing. In my own campaign world, it's like I'll have elections like this one, where quite frankly I don't have to compete. Domination is more fun in its own way, but it also gets you, gets you off your game a little bit. It's good every few years to have to compete, to understand, okay, we're not just going to dominate. And I think, we're in that place now. So let's work together to figure out, and not, wax nostalgic for the days when, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to compete? Okay, maybe, but we're going to have to compete. So let's go ahead and do it.
That's right. I guess we have one question just came in, sort of on with respect to technologies to in supply chains. There's many efforts going on in additive manufacturing, 3D printing, drones. How can government better provide incentives to industry and for reshoring? The DPA is one we've talked a lot about, but are there other kind of things that we can do?
Yeah, I'd have to think about that for a moment. I think, there are all kinds of tax policies, bunch of things. I would say from a DoD perspective, this gets back to Seth Moulton's Future of Defense Task Force. Make the investments. And there are some hard choices involved here. And I really want to compliment Secretary Esper because he's, the night court effort, the bottom-up review. He's really trying to look at this and say, how can we spend money in the most intelligent places? And part of the difficulty of that decision is everyone gets very excited about the idea of, we're not spending enough money on, as the questioner just pointed out, 3D printing, AI, the new technologies. Where the question gets difficult is, okay, where are we spending money that we can stop?
Right.
And that's where people tend to, well, no, we got to keep doing that.
Yeah.
Look, it's a zero-sum game, and this is, Secretary Esper's great frustration when I talk to him. Everyone tells me that we need to pivot to Asia, and I got to do all this stuff. But every time I say, okay, well, we're going to spend less over here. No, you got look. I only got so much,
Yeah.
only so much money, only so many resources, and if you're telling me I got to spend more over here, then I got to take them from somewhere.
Yeah.
We have to be able to make that prioritized decision, and I think in our system, that's tough. I mean, if you've been spending, people like to keep doing what they're used to doing. If you come along and say, hey, we're going to take that away, it's a tough fight. But if we're going to make the investments in those new technologies that are so crucial, we're going to have to make some decisions to stop spending money in some other places.
Okay. I think that's absolutely right. Well, Chairman Smith, I want to thank you for your time. Do you have any final thoughts or?
No, I really appreciate this discussion. I think there's an incredible opportunity going forward. I really just want to emphasize this is bipartisan. Whatever I may think about the Trump administration, that's not what I think about the Republicans that I work with. I wish they had been a little bit more willing to stop this particular problem before it got as far as it did, but bygones. We can work together on a bunch of issues. Congressman Banks, was right there with Moulton working on this task force. I think there was a lot of bipartisan talent in Congress and outside of Congress committed to working together to really address these issues. And I think we are making progress. I think we've got an opportunity to really significantly improve, our defense industrial base and our national security posture by making these improvements going forward from here. And I look forward to being part of that process and working with you on it.
Great. Well, thank you again for your time, Chairman Smith. And we're going to do a little recap after you sign off. I really appreciate your time and look forward to seeing how the NDAA goes and to engaging with you all again in the future.
Likewise. Great discussion. Good to see you. Look forward to working with you. Thanks.
Thank you.